honoring traditional knowledge in the fight against the climate crisis. So it was supposed to be the global environment editor, Jonathan Watts from The Guardian, but unfortunately you're stuck with me. So in a way, I guess the advantage of me is I'm not at all coming from this area. I'm a journalist originally, so I'm more coming from a general public point of view, public health. Of course, I know the huge value of traditional knowledge in public health, but for the rest of it, please forgive me if I say some things that may be a bit politically incorrect. Imagine that I'm coming from a general public point of view. So I'm very excited. As you know, this is about promoting the importance and the legal ownership of indigenous people and local communities, the land rights, as a necessity to achieve the national and international goals of forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. So this is a once a month series until October, and each webinar takes on a different topic. So it'll be taking place in English and translated simultaneously in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. We'll be taking questions in the second half, but we're going to have an opening discussion from some very erudite speakers, including, I think we're starting here. Thank you, everyone on the panel. We're going to start here with Gigi Buddy, who is an American Indian Tongva Mescalero artist and student studying theatre and performance with a particular focus on the environmental analysis at Pomona College. She served as the environmental community coordinator for the Human Impacts Institute and as an intern with the Arctic Cycle, two organizations that work on both art and climate change. Her passion for art and environmental justice led her to conduct research in the Malaysian Borneo alongside Pomona professors, and she has since been published in the EnviroLab Asia Academic Journal for her time in Malaysia. So her creative talents lead her to write songs and poetry and indigenous stories or creation on the indigenous justice action. We also have Mina Susanna Setra, an indigenous woman leader, Dayak Pompang. Correct me. Please correct me afterwards if I've said this wrong. From the West Kalimantan, Indonesia. She's currently the deputy to the Secretary General of the Aman and Social Cultural Affairs in Indonesia, and where they have 2,373 indigenous communities as active members. Mina is the founder of Ruai TV, a television outlet providing media access to marginalized communities in West Kalimantan. The station uses citizen journalism to give community members a voice. Fiore Longo is the director of the France and Spain offices of the NGO Survival International, which defends the rights of tribal people and coordinates its decolonized conservation and the Big Green Lie campaign. So now let's get on to the discussions with the Q&A. Please remember that you can use your chat section, and if Paolo or you want to WhatsApp her to get to me, that's great, but I will be checking the chat. So let's get going. Gigi, to start things off, this webinar focuses on different forms of knowledge and how the artists and climate change can make change or have an impact. So can you tell us a bit more about the organization and what you think needs to be done, in relation to indigenous and traditional knowledge? Gigi, over to you. Thank you. Is Gigi there?
Thank you, Samantha.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. Hi,
sorry
everybody.
About this. Let's go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I want to preface my answer to this question with just introducing myself fully. I'm Gigi. I'm Tongva Indian and Mescalero Apache, and I'm currently residing on Tongva land. But I'm originally from the Bay Area in California, which is the rightful land of the Coast Miwok tribe. But on to my answers. Thank you again, Samantha. Artists and Climate Change is actually an initiative of a larger nonprofit organization called the Arctic Cycle, which is an organization that I have spent the last year working for as an intern, and it has been lovely. But before my gap year from school that I took off because of the pandemic, I had previously collaborated with Chantal Bilodeau, who is the founder, and the Arctic Cycle in the fall of 2019, when my college and I produced an event for Climate Change Theater Action. Climate Change Theater Action, or CCTA, is another initiative of the Arctic Cycle, in which 50 playwrights from around the world are commissioned to write short plays based on a prompt that has to do with our climate crisis. It happens biannually, so that actually means that this year is a CCTA year, and I can absolutely talk more about that later if anyone has questions. But I will also forward the link to the website so anyone can explore the initiative on their own. But my specific work within the Arctic Cycle has revolved around getting CCTA up and running, but also has allowed me to create my own series through Artists and Climate Change, which is a blog and international network that publishes essays, interviews, and editorials with the purpose of creating community and promoting the inclusion of arts in the global climate change conversation. So my series is entitled Indigenous Voices. And I created it with the intention to share knowledge about Indigenous artists who are working at the intersection of theater and environmental justice. So my series focuses on both the experiences and of Indigenous artists, as well as Native narratives, which include history, traditions, art, cultures that have been severely oppressed and oftentimes are left out of the art world and the climate justice conversation. So during my time working on this series, I have had the pleasure to interview many artists, people like Cherokee playwright Catherine Nagel, who is also a tribal sovereignty and land rights lawyer. I think these experiences have been monumental in my own education and identity, which has been just, a wonderful journey to be going on. And I think this series also, I see a lot of myself in these powerful Indigenous artists who also have passions that align with their indigeneity. I think it's really important to note and acknowledge that Indigenous communities are the rightful caretakers of this land, and that we have a wealth of knowledge that can help guide policy to implement sustainable and positive change when it comes to our environmental crisis. I also think it's equally as important to acknowledge and embrace art as an effective tool to communicate climate issues. I think sometimes there can be quite a strong disconnect between science and academia and accessibility. And I strongly believe that art really starts to blur that line so that more people can easily understand environmental issues. Understanding these complex and very impactful issues gives people agency to act and create change. And I think art, especially performing arts and theater, is a really valuable tool to get people to think differently about our environment. I think art is a really important role in space because it allows facts to be communicated in a way that appeals to emotions.
Okay, Gigi, sorry to interrupt. This sounds great. So can you give us an example? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit mindful of time. Can you give us an example of some of the great work that you're doing, and maybe a reading or something you might want to share to give an example of how you're doing this? Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, of course. So I'm also a performer. I am studying theater performance. But on top of that, I also write my own poetry. And then a lot of it has to do with my own relationship to my indigeneity, and the importance of talking about traditional knowledge as a resource for climate solutions. And I do have a poem here that I would love to read, born of my own experience of existing in this world and of bringing with me generations of warriors that live with me and around me, of environmental trauma and familial knowledge and my studies as a student. So this poem is really a melting pot of all of that. And I've never read it for anyone in this capacity. So I hope you enjoy. This poem is called The Wild Things. I scour the streets, wondering where the wild things went. Like the breeze that wraps itself around the leaves of trees and takes my secrets far away. like the snow that softly melts from the tops of mountains and flows into rivers that burst with life, like stars that dance in darkness, in the quiet, untouched land that beams with stories of creation, and my imagination runs free with the wild things. I don't remember when they started to disappear, only that I cried when the Big Dipper was no longer clear in the sky because of smoke that poured from forests crying for help. If the land is hurt, parts of me break and fold under the pressure of losing roots that were meant to last. Knowledge exists in my bones, placed there by generations of healing hands that cared for the undying lands. But just like a ship is dubbed unsinkable, these lands are withering. The sound of a new built world drowns out the voices screaming from our bones. But we are not alone. We are legends strong and warrior hearts that beat in rhythm with each other and the pulse of this earth. If you listen to the world, you'll hear us. And if you just open your eyes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I feel like I should clap. That was so beautiful. That's really very moving. I wish I had, I think that's what's really amazing when you hear these things is you feel this soul, you share it so well. Thank you very much. I mean, talking about your own roots and how do you work with the elders to transfer this knowledge, both using the traditional, this beautiful poetry that you're speaking about?
Sure. I feel like there's a couple of different parts to this, and one is my own identity and my own roots, and then how my role in my community. I feel in a lot of ways I'm still trying to figure out my identity and my own relationship to indigeneity, because I was raised off the res. Some might call I'm an urban Indian. And so my relationship to tradition and culture has come from my mother, who is my elder, but my mother. She taught my brother and I the importance of talking sticks and talking circles. I think most of my creative endeavors also stem from my mother. And I think that those then stem from a culture that is about storytelling and myths and song and dance and beating and creativity in general. And I think she did her best to expose me to that crucial part of my identity. She grew up in a very different world than I do now. And I'm privileged to be able to explore my passions and my desires to help my people. And I always keep her in the forefront of my mind because I know that she didn't have the same experiences. But going on to my community, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend the Stanford Powwow, which is the largest powwow on the West Coast of the United States. And I think that was a really transformative, it was really transformative for my relationship with other tribes and indigenous communities in general. Currently, I now work as a head mentor for the Indigenous Peer Mentor Program at my college, which is a mentor program that is designed to support Indigenous students. And while here at Pomona College, I have had the immense pleasure to be on Tongva land, to be on my tribal land. I've been able to learn from community members and elders that work to sustain our culture and work with the land. I don't think I've had any firsthand encounters with members of the community that specifically relate to climate issues, but I think with every interaction, there is a transfer of knowledge and tradition that I can then pass on. And I can pair it with my own education as it relates to the environment. For example, my last article written for Artists and Climate Change was written for World Indigenous Peoples Day, and it focused on the traditional caretaking practices of Indigenous communities and how they relate to climate solutions. So I talked about the Karak tribe of Northern California and their practice of using cultural burns and how the US has implemented policy to deter not deter, they quite literally stopped Indigenous communities from being able to practice things like controlled burning, which actually have immense helpful ways that they help the environment. I think Western influence and knowledge has villainized fire. And only within the last 20 years or so, we've seen a small policy shift and now adopting controlled burning techniques, which is from indigenous communities. It's their practice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful. Sorry, I'm just a bit aware of time. I hope we can come back to more of that on these cultural burning and others. I mean, I know in Italy, for example, everyone does it. There's always like a burning to stop actually the bigger fires. I don't know if that's that's to me from an outside, that's what it sounds like. Okay, so thank you very much. Moving on to Fiore. I mean, there's also some communities have been divided, between, say, some of the elders who maybe resist some of the change. And then, for example, some of the young indigenous leaders who strike deals with miners and loggers because they've grown up with those kind of ideas of, the more of a market economy. How do you work with these different views in your area of work?
Yeah, well, hello. First of all, I think it's important to say that change is normal and for every society in the world. Indigenous peoples change as we do, and they have conflicts between generations as we do, and some of the things are completely inevitable and not up to us to comment on that. What we can do is to analyze which are the reasons of these individual behaviors. So what is actually putting far away the people from their own knowledge. And what we see is that for indigenous peoples in a lot of places in the world, knowledge is linked to the land. So if they lose the control of the land and they lose access to the land, there is also a division with their knowledge. So I think that we should be questioning is why those lands are being stolen in the first place, and what we can do to support them to be in control of their land and also in control of their own education. Because another of these reasons of that can create problems between generations is what kind of education indigenous peoples are getting. Most of the time is an education imposed by the state, based mostly on telling them that they are primitives and they have to forget everything they know. And Survival International has a campaign against this forced schooling, what we call factory schools. And we are also working to push governments to recognize the land's right of indigenous peoples, because without their lands, they can't actually exercise any control on their own lives. So what we are fighting against is multinational companies, governments, but also conservation organizations that are stealing indigenous people's lands.
Yeah, thank you. Mina, sorry, I'm just checking here. Sorry, Fiore, one more question for you. How can outside organizations help indigenous knowledge to spread, or so-called decolonize youth climate movements and climate science?
Well, I think it's not other organizations that should help indigenous peoples. It's actually we should help ourselves to be ourselves, not indigenous people, to be closer to indigenous communities and to listen to them. And one of the things I realized I work on the field of conservation. So my work is actually fighting against conservationists that are not listening indigenous people, is that they are not listening them at all. They only listen the ones who are telling what they want to listen. And the indigenous voices are excluded from international summits, are excluded for the tables of decision. We just go there and tell them this is what we're going to do. So I think that what we need is a knowledge of the fact that the problem is here, the problems are rooted in the global north, and that that the indigenous people have been protecting their territories and protecting biodiversity, protecting the planet for generations, and that we are the ones who need to learn. And I think that this is something very, very far away of what is going on, including in a lot of the climate movement here in Europe, but also because the focus of climate movement is climate. And climate is sometimes not being seen as a part of a bigger issue. It's not only about climate. The problem here is about the capitalist system, and we should be talking about that and how to change that. Climate is the consequence of that system. But if we just focus on climate and we just keep pushing about, ecology or environment as things that are completely separate from social justice, I don't really think that this decolonization is going to happen.
I mean, sometimes, sorry, this is just a bit of a personal question. Sometimes when you see it from the outside, it seems like there's a lot of data flying around, and then they kind of bring in the indigenous groups for a bit of color, if you want, like as a secondary thought. I mean, how do you bring these to, you know, in the media especially? It seems, okay, you have the data, you have the scientists arguing about climate change, and then, oh, well, let's bring an indigenous leader and talk about, you know, some rare leaf or something. I mean, that's what it seems like from an outside point of view. There's a bit of a disconnect. I mean, how do you actually make it work so that it's not just, so that the indigenous have, I don't know whether there's a lack of data or what is it that's going to bring this discussion together? I mean, also, Gigi, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but it just seems there's a bit of a disconnect. Fiona, sorry.
Yeah, well, of course it's disconnect, because the first thing that we need to do is not bringing an indigenous person to talk, it's recognizing their land's rights. Right. If they don't have access to their land, then any kind of this of thing, even the idea that they can choose free, that they're free to choose and decide, if we are not here acknowledging the right of the land, is something that is fake. People are not, they're not in power and in the position to choose if they don't have access to the land, and they can't feed themselves, and they can't support their own culture or way of life. For indigenous people, land is life, and that for me is the first knowledge. We can keep, you know, talking about climate, Western science, as something completely distant from the fact that we are stealing indigenous people's land and resource to maintain our own way of life. So I think that before bringing indigenous people, we should be first the ones changing. We should change our way of life. We should understand that it's the global north who is destroying indigenous people's land to maintain our way of life. And then we are able to have a dialogue. But what kind of dialogue can we think we have if we are not in an asymmetry, in an equivalent position, because we are the ones stealing their lands. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can bring Mina in here. I don't know, Mina, if you have any comment on this and from your experience within indigenous people and working where you are in Indonesia.
Yeah, I think it's really important to provide some kind of evidence of our claim. We have been forced to provide evidence of our claim. For example, we talk about traditional knowledge as our contribution from our traditional knowledge, or our local initiative. Like in Indonesia, we have this indigenous youth initiative, what we call homecoming movement initiative, or coming home initiative, which started a few years ago. It started in 2015, where there was a big gathering of indigenous youth in Indonesia, and there were discussions on the state of indigenous territories, the conflict that happened so many times, land grabbing, criminalization of our leaders, and the youth, they come to a moment where they were thinking, what can we do to help these situations? You know, as youth, what can we do? So they think about these ideas of, we have to call all other youth in the cities to return back home, to help our elders, our communities, to defend and protect and also manage our territories. So that's how the idea come from. And you know, many indigenous youth actually stuck in the cities. The cause of this is because there's a wrong perception about education and job. You know, mainly people here, not only indigenous, but also generally in Indonesia, people think that it's only cities that provide job. And if you want to have a good job, you have to have a good education. And good education you can only find in the cities. So parents will send their children to go to the cities to study. And then they expect them to stay in the cities so they can find job. Many times, even when the youth return back home, their parents will ask them, like, so what is the money I give you for your education if at the end you return back to your communities? You know, there's always there's something like that come out. So the youth think that we need to change these perceptions, and at the same time, we can also help to defend and protect our territories. So they start this homecoming movement, 2015. There were 3 indigenous girls started this movement by establishing indigenous schools in 3 locations, in North Kalimantan, West Kalimantan, and North Sulawesi. So they started, and since then, now we have 82 indigenous schools everywhere in Indonesia. And of course, the indigenous schools is really important as a means of transmissions knowledge from the elders to the younger generations. And we are still have more indigenous youth working now, and more indigenous schools is coming up. Still in the process. We got a report from different places where indigenous schools is in process to start up, and they are not stopped there. So the youth, after they start with the indigenous homecoming with the indigenous schools, they expand the ideas to other things. So they also start. They think about how can we directly involve in managing our territories. Oh, I wish I can show photos here. So they ask permissions from elders to work on piece of land in their territories. And they form groups of youth from communities, combined with youth coming home from cities. And they start farming activities like building vegetable gardens and herbal or medicine plant gardens. And even some of them combine these farming activities with educational ecotourism too. And this now it start change the perception in the communities, because now these activities can really also create job for the youth, and they can also gain income from this. In North Sulawesi, the one group youth, for example, they can gain about 15,000 USD in one harvest. Much more than they can gain when they work in the cities. But the most important things from this homecoming movement is not about the money, but about the indigenous youth thinking about their future. And their future is their land and territories. That is the most important things. And so they start working on their territories while they can also defend their territories, because many indigenous territories now left defenseless because the youth are everywhere else. They're not in the communities. They left only the children, elders, and women most vulnerable in the communities. No, so now when they come home, the communities have more defenders, because they are there. They work there, and they can defend their village, their communities together. I think that is the most important things about this. And I think to create examples like this is really important when we talk about climate change and what we can contribute. Start with local initiative. I think it's really important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And how do you see how other predominantly Western youth movements, such as Fridays for Future and Sunrise, how could they collaborate on the indigenous groups and the Western groups? How could they make it easier?
I think it's a very interesting idea to combine, because I think each group has its specific uniqueness in starting their initiative. No, it's depend on where you are. You cannot just make the same things everywhere, because it's depend on your locations, your situations. No, if the indigenous youth can start at the farming movement because they have land and they were working on their own land, maybe in the cities the youth can start farming like the how do you call it, the farm in your own house, where you can use aqua farming, for example, or more like organic kind of farming, and create some initiative with other youth, form groups to work on these ideas. I think we can come up with so many unique initiative. No, you can also, you can combine or mix it, or youth has so many crazy ideas. I've been working with the youth in the last few years, and I was like, sometimes we have to stay to them, calm down, do this one by one, because before they finish one thing, they want to start another thing. So I think this is a really great energy that we have to work on. We have to invest in this youth energy. I will be really, really grateful if many people more working with the youth, because this is the future, and they already think about their future. I think that is most important things, because when we talk about the continuation of the planet, we are talking about them, but now they are already talking about themselves. So this is really, I think it's really exciting.
So I think everyone agrees there's some fantastic, starting with the great poem we had and all the fabulous energy coming from the youth. I've just got a question here. Sorry, I'm reading this question, which was already written, about the latest IP. So thinking more on the structured way, on the latest IPCC assessment report, it noted that the indigenous and local knowledge can, quote, accelerate wide-scale behavior change consistent with adapting to and limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the scientists, like the economists before them, say they know how to measure the benefits. So 2 questions from this. How do we get out of the absurd situation where the scientists say it is valuable, but because we can't put a number on it, we can't incorporate it into our calculations? And can you give 1 or 2 examples, ideally with numbers, that show how it can be done?
Well,
that makes
yeah. Well, for me, Samantha, first thing, it doesn't really make sense that scientists come up with these conclusions, that we cannot put numbers on it so we can incorporate it into our calculations. Sounds like not a scientist statement, while they can put numbers on everything else, including the calculation of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or they can calculate the age of the universe. I mean, you may not be, for indigenous traditional knowledge, you may not be able to value the knowledge, but you can always calculate the impacts of that knowledge. And in this case, for example, they can start by putting numbers by calculating the benefit from the indigenous low carbon lifestyle, for example. How indigenous low carbon lifestyle contribute in balancing emissions. I thought it should be simple and doable, especially for scientists, or calculate the impact of traditional knowledge practices to climate. We have many examples like the nice Kio ritual in South Amanuban Dawan indigenous communities in east part of Indonesia. It is an effort to protect the forest by stipulating a ban for anyone to enter the forest, which is ritualized. And there is also a ban on cutting down forest called Hutan Teringkang in Hibun Dayak community in West Kalimantan, or the Rumbio Forbidden Forest in Kenegerian Rumbio in Kampar, Riau. Our traditional Pahompa ritual in East Sumba also strictly prohibit anyone from entering the forest area and taking forest product. I mean, scientists can calculate the benefit from the result of those traditional knowledge, like the standing forest, clean ocean and river, biodiversity, clean water, carbon, etc. Actually, if this is done, it will be the most powerful method of this millennium in saving the earth and human from extinction. I think so.
So what do the others think of adding numbers from the traditional, translating the traditional knowledge or ways and translating it into numbers that work well in charts and for Western audiences? What do the others think of it? Is that important for moving forward on these issues?
I don't know if I can reply to that question, if that's okay for Gigi and Mina. I think that recognizing and respecting the rights of human beings according to the contribution to climate change is very dangerous. We don't have rights as human beings because we do good recycling. indigenous people have rights independently of how much they contribute to climate change or no, and they have right to their land independently of how much they protect biodiversity. That said, every evidence we have show that they are the best protecting biodiversity, that there is less deforestation and 80% of biodiversity on indigenous people's territories. Nevertheless, we keep not recognizing their land's rights, and that's very important to understand. And we keep thinking that putting a couple of numbers on how much they avoid climate or how much they avoid deforestation is going to help. Actually, it's the opposite, because numbers finance like a lot numbers. And now the finance is saying we can compensate our emissions by the number, X number of the emissions that indigenous peoples are not doing or are not producing by protecting their forests. What happened is that a lot of companies are now paying or funding projects to compensate their emissions. So I don't know, Shell, Eni, they say, well, if we pay, we buy, or we pay to a project or planting trees or whatever, or protecting a land of an indigenous person, we can compensate our emissions. And I think that, again, this is avoiding the real problem. The problem is here in our societies. Independent of what indigenous peoples do, they do it great, but that shouldn't hide the fact that we are the ones polluting and destroying the planet, and it's our responsibility to do something about it.
Okay, that's so putting the responsibility back there. What about you, Gigi? What do you think about putting numbers on or measuring somehow on the indigenous side?
Well, I think that that's like a very inherently Western view and take on traditional knowledge, which I think is two contradicting ideas, right? Like, how are you supposed to communicate indigenous knowledge but do it through a Western lens? So I think that inherently is very problematic, and that inherently contradicts each other and is not actually productive in achieving the goal that I think it's meaning to do. I also, as an artist, do not like numbers. I'm not about the mathematical STEM side. I think that there, like I said before, there's a really, really big disconnect between, especially in Western culture, because we have such a big disparity in our education and how we're learning. I think that academia and science are just not accessible. And so when you're taking knowledge that could be accessible if you promoted it in the way that it is and you shared it and embraced it and celebrated it in its form, in that true form, instead you're placing numbers on it, you're putting it through a very Western and scientific lens, you're inherently making it less accessible. And so I think that overall it's just a series of problematic and contradicting impacts, intentions versus impacts. And so I think, at the base of it, it all starts with education and rethinking the way that our institutions function with each other, and acknowledging in every part of the world. This is very true. Acknowledging the trauma and horrors and just cultural and erasure of people and traditions that actually have a place in society, and specifically with the climate crisis have solutions. I don't think that those need to be communicated through science and numbers. I think that as evidence, it can help in the scientific community, but okay. I think there are other ways.
But the reality is that, to move politicians around the world or to get people to change, or companies, we need to sort of work through traditional media in a way. Like you said, Gina, you're working also through, was it the television, or you're also using, media. How can we bring these two worlds together? So we've got the issue of the older, as Mina was saying, the older generations, the younger generations, and we have this audiences out there, even like through social media. Especially with COVID, social media is even more important. So how do you influence these audiences and these politicians using the modern means, but maybe bringing out some of these traditional strengths that you're talking about? Maybe, Gina, do you want to start on that, and then Mina? Because you gave some good examples, Mina, on maybe translating some of these traditional practices. But from what Mina was saying, many of the young people anyway have moved to the city. So how do we bridge this gap, the generational gap, and then like the traditional and say the social media to have more of an effect, to bring these things forward? Gina, do you want to start?
Do you mean me?
Sorry, yes, Gigi, sorry, Gina,
Oh, okay.
Gigi, sorry, Gigi, Gigi, sorry, apologies.
Combining names there. I think that
I'm mixing Gigi and Mina. Yeah, Gina, no, Gigi. Sorry, start with Gigi. Go to Mina. Yeah.
I mean, just like briefly touching on Mina's point of like, you know, young people are moving to the city. I mean, that is, you know, because of everything that has trickled down upon, you know, indigenous peoples, right? Like that's usually because there has been some greater force, usually governments that, you know, impose their own ideas and traditions and control over indigenous communities that end up creating that sort of way of life where the traditional way of life is just not sustainable. And I think that bridging this gap between, you know, this older generation and, you know, like social media and young people, I mean, I think we're already starting to see that, right? Like with COP26 coming up, we see like a huge movement of young people coming into the scene. And I mean, I have this view of indigenous peoples as well, of that we should not be the ones who are burdened with educating people. I believe that for young people too. I mean, it is also inherently problematic that young people will accept the burden of what older generations do. However, we're the ones who have to educate, especially in policy and at a place like COP26 at the you know, United Nations Climate Change Conference. I think that things like art, going back to just where my passions lie, art is really powerful, right? Like even when we see like Hamilton, that is taking an inherently problematic narrative, but kind of flipping it on its head and giving it a completely different lens, right? And so we start to think about education and history in different ways that are actually working towards finding these solutions and educating people in a way that is accessible and you know, welcoming, and it does not put the burden of educating on just young people and on just traditional caretakers.
Mm-hmm. Mina, what do you think about this bridging the gap, or how it can be done better? I'm also looking at some questions coming in from the audience, but maybe we can finish on that. Mina, how do you think moving forward we can bridge, you know, between the generations and say using the modern media, or how do you think is the best way to influence?
Yeah, I think indigenous peoples are very dynamic. Yeah, we can also embrace knowledge from outside, like this modern knowledge with the smartphone for our communication. Indigenous peoples youth in Indonesia also started this movement called smartphone for communications. So they use smartphone. They learn how to use smartphone to write their stories, to post it in their the stories and photos, and also how to make an audio visual from their cell phone and use it for the campaign. Campaign about their activities, about their initiatives, about their view, and using social media like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you know. And I think that is something that we can always, of course, this modern technology has an impacts also to indigenous communities, yeah. But the most important things is, I think, for us is how to use this, how to prevent the negative impact and use the positive for the benefit of protecting our land and territories. I think the most important things from the whole discussion is there is no culture without our land and territories.
There's no what, sorry?
There is no culture without our land and territories. The land and territories is the foundation of all our culture. If we lose our land, if we lose our territories, we will lose our identity, because we lost our rituals, we will lose our dancing, we will lose our singing, we will lose our knowledge, knowledge in managing our territories. So many things, even our astronomy knowledge on astronomy, the agriculture system. So many things will be lost if we lose our land and territory. So this is the most basic things. So I saw also some question talking about the arteries or the carbon market and everything. We don't care about those. What the most important things for indigenous peoples is the protection of our land and territories. Without that, nothing else can come. You know, in few years ago, indigenous peoples talk about no rights, no right. So it means we put our rights first. Everything else is behind that. I think that.
Sorry, what was it? No rights, no what?
No rights, no RED. REDD. That's a few years ago when the discussion about REDD was really like.
No rights, no RED. Okay. In fact, I see there's some questions on here. The RED. I'm sorry, I'm just looking now. I'm just looking at the time. Okay, there's really interesting points coming up, and there's now a lot of comments coming in from the audience. Would it be easier if I just read a couple of the questions from the audience, and then you guys take turns at answering it, or how do you want to do this? Is that good? Okay, so let's do some of the questions from the audience. Okay, so we've got. Hold on, I just saw there was something from Bangladesh. We've got some positions being shared. Sorry, I'm just trying to find some direct questions. Guys, in the audience, if you want to ask some specific questions related to what we've just been saying, so there's a lot of comments. I don't know if you can post them again on the bottom. We've got some comments on subsoil. There was someone from Bangladesh saying, how can they, is there a requirement to rethink education for non-indigenous people, which encourages them for non-sustainable life and pursuits? Hello folks, so if you could, there's some really interesting comments, but if you could frame it as a question.
Sorry, Samantha, the questions are in the question and answer box, not in the participant chat. And they are framed as questions.
Oh, right. Okay, great.
Yeah, there are two things. No, I just.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just different groups do different things. Okay. So, but people are asking, do we have any pictures to promote that people want to share? What can we do as a community to promote and ensure indigenous community inclusivity on climate change? I'm just looking here at the one from Barkala. So sorry, what is the question? If you could keep your questions short and to the point. Sorry, I don't know if any of you have seen questions you'd like to pick up on here. Are you guys looking at the Q&A? We have a question for Fiona. How are you looking at partnerships with these organizations on trust and ethical standards?
With conservation organizations. Yeah, I saw the question. Well, the main conservation organizations like WWF, WCS, African Parks don't actually have any kind of ethical standard, unfortunately. And what we do, we have been pushing not them because they say they have ethical standards, but then it's not true on the field. What we are trying to change in survival is the funding going to these organizations. So we are trying to push governments mainly to adopt very, very important requirements when funding conservation projects. Because at the day of today, everything that has the word conservation, climate, they just go there without any kind of control. And what we are making sure is that governments always ensure that for any project, even if linked to biodiversity, there is the consent of indigenous peoples and the indigenous people's rights are respected. What we are also trying to do is that all the new, I don't know if you have heard about the 30% or climate finance or RED Plus project, instead of all these projects that sounds good on paper, but of course are linked to Western organizations, instead of these as solutions for climate change, what we are trying to push for from survival is to recognize, first of all, indigenous people's territories. That should be the main mechanism for protection of biodiversity, and start looking, as I keep repeating, at what we are doing. So we should be punishing all corporations for destroying the environment instead of creating more protected areas on the land of someone else.
Okay, that's clear. So we've got another question here. Thank you very much. It is very clear that where there are indigenous people, there is a forest. It's very clear about the indigenous. Okay, no, that's not a question. What does the panel think is the role of schools the world over to teach and revive lost indigenous value systems? Maybe we can start, Mina. Do you want to talk about that? What do you think is the role of schools in the world over, teaching and reviving lost indigenous value systems? Well, first of all, we'd have to identify them, right? And they'd have to be put in a teachable way, I guess. How would you comment or answer that question on the role of schools?
Well, I think especially for the role of indigenous schools is really important because, again, I will say that it is indigenous school is like a means of transmission of traditional knowledge from the elders to the youth, even from the young age, very young age of children. But indigenous schools also comes in different form. There is indigenous schools that is managed with curriculums, with the schedules, and etc. But also there is the most important things is also the living indigenous schools. I think that is the most important things because that is the way of life where children can participate in daily activities of their parents, their elders, from the rituals, from planting, agriculture activities. So they learn by doing. So this is the most important. Living school is very important thing. Although at this in this time we face the situation where the knowledge keeper is less and less these days. No, many elders who have the knowledge already gone, and we need an urgent transmission of this knowledge to the younger generations, and it's not really a fast process. So we need to do this by establishing more indigenous schools and ensuring this transmission through these schools. But there's also another way to do. We need to have more documentations of this knowledge, and also ensuring this documentations become a living documentations too, because documentation will useless if we don't practice it.
Right. So, I mean, because the question is also, how do we translate that the world over, so that school children, in France or Brazil or wherever they are, they understand the importance of this. I mean, from what you're saying, it's also linked to the land, the practical knowledge. I mean, realistically, how, do you think it's important that children all over the world learn something about this indigenous knowledge? And how would you even begin to categorize it? I don't know, Gigi, if you have any ideas about that also, because you're living in a bit, between both worlds.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I've touched upon this like a little bit, education is kind of the first step. I mean, acknowledging and accepting is the first step. But then education comes after that. I think that, especially in the United States, we have a severe lack of truthful education around the actual history and founding of this country. And so anything that's built on top of that, any, learning that's done on top of that is already just contributing to erasure and colonization. And so I think that, I think children are very smart human beings. And I think that they are very, very capable of learning hard information, like tough information to swallow in a way that, uses rhetoric that they can understand. I think that children are very capable of taking on that information and starting the decolonization process of their own learning and of learning that they share, with their classmates and others. I think they're very capable of that. I think that we don't give them, enough credit for being able to do that. But also especially in the United States, our education system is not geared towards actually educating on our history. And so again, there's a disconnect between the actual truth of what is happening and then that what people are learning. And I think that, for me in higher ed and growing up with, with a background of being American Indian, I've gotten multiple sides of the, education system. And I'm able to identify its flaws in a way that's productive and effective. But not everyone has those tools because they haven't grown up with them, and schools aren't teaching them. And so I think that there is a, institutionalized problem that we need to address.
I mean, yeah, that's because in fact, the person asking the question has said it's more about teaching indigenous values in, for example, Western schools. I mean, if you were to pick the top 3 things that you think should be taught at school the world over, I mean, obviously, Mina, you were saying more that it's more about the practice, to not forget or to not lose some of these traditional practices in the traditional schools. But if you would say, what is like the top 3 things that should be taught about the value, linked to indigenous, what would it be? Mina, and then maybe we'll go around the table. Because that kind of summarizes what is it that people need to learn. You said they're linked to the land. I mean, what would be the 3 things? I mean, for example, my nephews, they go to forest school where they're trying to learn about, I don't know, identifying mushrooms. I mean, I'm just saying really practically, these is like about, how would you translate this into something that school children the world over should learn about? Mina, I don't know if you want to start.
I think it's the first thing we have to do is, I'm sorry, my daughter.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the first thing we have to do is to introduce the nature and for us indigenous peoples to the children, to the students. We have program like this a few years ago. We call it Indigenous Goes to Schools. It's not means like we schooling the indigenous peoples, but we bring some indigenous peoples youth, the indigenous youth, to the schools in the cities like Jakarta, and they themselves explain about who they are and how their life to other students. And we have like we have like a one-day festival in that schools about indigenous peoples. We have movies. We have like a dancing lesson, something like that, just to introduce our culture to the students. And actually, they really like it. And they from that they come out with a how do you say? I lost the words in English. They start to they want to know more about this. No, and at the end they also start thinking about who is my ancestors. We have this is very interesting because then the students also start thinking about their own ancestors after our program. And we can start by that, by introducing our culture. Not a difficult way first. Don't talk about conflict first, but talk about the relation between indigenous and the universe and the nature, and how we've been protecting the nature and our connection with them, the spiritual connections. With more like not start with heavy things, conflict or criminalization, something like that. No, but start with that. I think that can bring curiosity. That's the word I'm looking for. Curiosity from the students, especially students in the cities, and that can also bring the curiosity to reconnect with the nature.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I mean, especially now with COVID, everyone's used to sort of seeing things I mean, not everyone has the privilege of being, if they're living in an urban school, in London or New York, they don't have the privilege always of even being even close to nature. I mean, maybe, do you think there's a way that you could bring this connection of youth around the world, like through Zoom, or where they can explain exactly, as you say, the link with nature, what the spiritual, the ancestors? I mean, there's a lot of interest in that. Do you think that would be doable, or is it unrealistic? Also, Gigi, I don't know, do you think anyone in New York would be interested in, that kind of thing?
Samantha, I'm sorry to interrupt, and Gigi as well. Samantha, just to let you know that some of the questions are on a Google Doc that I'll just place in the chat for you. Just after.
Yeah, if you could summarize and just put
Yes.
the question in a way that makes sense, just so I don't make some silly statement, because it's not my area of expertise. But I love this idea. I think my nephews would totally love it. It'd be amazing. I don't know, Gigi, do you think it's realistic in the US, or people think it's ridiculous? And then also, Fiona, is this something that's interesting to mobilize young people? I mean, we saw the impact, just of one young person, protesting. I mean, maybe this sharing is that something that's realistic to mobilize people, or, with the art and with online, for example?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Well, it was, I mean, Mina was saying, that it was really helpful, say, in Indonesia, that they were able to bring people into the classroom, say, in Jakarta, young people from indigenous communities. I mean, obviously, not everyone has the opportunity, or there's the way of making everyone travel in person. Do you think there's ways that we could link young people, on Zoom or virtually? Or do you think, for example, kids in New York wouldn't be interested in what indigenous kids are doing, let's say on a reservation or back home? Or do you think that's not realistic?
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think that one thing that's really special with youth, especially in today's technology, is they're really eager to connect through this, ether of the internet, which is wonderful. I think that in places like California, New York, like Massachusetts, I think there are relatively liberal and progressive ways of thinking. And so I think that, younger people who have had more of a balanced education would be really interested in that. I know that a lot of my peers here definitely are, and they want to learn about the land they're on, and they want to learn more about, what's going on with like the Indigenous Student Alliance here. So I see it happening for myself. I think the issue lies with people who haven't received any sort of education or learning or instillment of like fundamental values that would create an openness to that. I think that is kind of the barrier that we're at. Of there are people that are listening and choosing not to take action. There are people that are listening and choosing to take action, but then there's people who aren't listening and aren't interested in, working on decolonizing their selves and their mind and their community. So I think that the answer to your question is yes and no. I see change happening in my own community with my own peers and other, youth that I'm involved with. But I think that also stems from them being progressive individuals who are eager to learn in that way. You can't force somebody to try and understand, your values and your culture. They won't enact positive change if that's so.
But I mean, I don't know. I think I love the idea of, say, kids in England or France being able to learn about indigenous, whether it's the art or the snakes. I mean, people are really fascinated by the nature. And as you say, there's this idea, this much closer thing of nature. I don't know. I think it's a fantastic idea. I don't know whether it's like a global day when you can do, or, every 6 months where there's like the Indigenous Day, and then the values and the spiritual, as you were saying, Mina, and the ancestors, the idea of these ancestors that are kind of up there or in nature. I think it's a great idea. I mean, maybe it's happening, but, especially if you can then link in the art. I mean, even now, just looking at these NFTs, this non-fungible tokens, where, there's a lot of you see people are selling designs like from the Aboriginal, the Aborigine communities in Australia have the most beautiful design. It almost seems like these things should be belonging originally where they belong and then shared. I'm just thinking totally out there, but I think it's a great idea. Right, more questions on this. Do we have an agroecology or nature-based solutions to developing cities regional solutions? Sorry, am I not reading that correctly? Are you guys looking at the Q&As?
Samantha, there's just a Google Doc that we've put together with everyone's questions from the audience, and I'm just pasting it to you in the chat.
Okay, so is this going in the Q&A? I think it's if we can just keep it on the Q&A, because otherwise it's quite difficult to keep track of all the questions. Okay, we've got a lot of it. The people are really interested in this idea of the schools of passing on knowledge. If you guys see another question you want to answer, because there's quite a lot coming in here. Are you guys looking at the questions? I love this idea of the indigenous school and sharing it virtually. I think it's brilliant. People would love it. At least I know in London, my nephews would totally love it. But I don't know how. Okay, sorry. Can we get? There are other questions coming up here. We have India 20 being displaced. Okay, we need questions. We've got comments coming in, but we need some more questions. I'm sorry, I don't know who was speaking there. If you have another question you want to put forward that you've seen from your Google Docs, because I can't see it on here.
So there's a specific one for Fiore, which is what are strategies or ways? There's another specific one for Fiore, which is what are strategies or ways in which access to or ownership of indigenous land to their communities can be guaranteed. That's one of them.
Okay. All right, should we take two at a go? Well, let's start with that one.
Fiore, I can also copy paste it to you in case that's easier.
I think I replied to that question in private, but I can say it here. There is just one binding legal tool to about the recognition of indigenous people's land rights, which is the ILO 169, that very few governments in Europe have ratified. And then there is the Declaration of the UN on Indigenous Peoples that also is a good instrument. What we should be making sure is not only that our own government ratified the convention, but that for every project or every even business that affect, or every climate solution that might affect Indigenous people's land, those standards are applying and they are respect. Even of any agreement, the European Commission signed an agreement with the Mercosur. The ILO 169 should be part of the agreement, which unfortunately is not the case, but that is the best way to guarantee that Indigenous people's rights are respected.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question, a short question? I'm just going through these.
Maybe, yes, Samantha, maybe I can paraphrase one of the questions coming from the audience from Deepak Chetri.
Yes, please do. That would be really helpful.
Yeah, he's asking if the legal protection laws for indigenous peoples, for example, Article 370, is that enough to effectively protect the rights of the land and its resources? Maybe that's something that Mina can answer. If the legal protection that exists in different countries today is enough, is sufficient.
Well, in Indonesia, we don't have legal protection yet. We've been working in this past few years for legal protection for indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples' rights law is still being discussed now in the parliament, and we are working closely with them on this, just to ensure that the content is really from our side, yeah. And we do have some rights recognized in some laws, like traditional knowledge, for example, that is in the environmental law. We do have recognition of indigenous people's traditional rights, traditional knowledge, and also on the coastal areas and small islands law, we have recognition of indigenous territories from in small islands and coastal areas. And we have almost 100 local regulations that recognize indigenous people's rights. But we don't have the main law yet that we really need, the indigenous people's rights law, the national law. If you ask that if these laws are strong enough to protect our rights, no. There are so many elements that makes all these laws weak. Yeah, like the companies still have more power in our system. They can influence the laws and regulations. They have money to bribe our governments, and they can even bribe the police or military. And this is, I think, happen everywhere in many indigenous land. But still we need to have this legal protection. So at least we have something to defend ourselves. And we're still working on that. Yeah, but that's why I think this is why we need to work in many different instruments, including international instruments, and use many different opportunities to ensure our rights are protected. But when people ask that we should not calculate our value, our indigenous knowledge, for example, when we talk about that, it's not, when I talk about that in the beginning, it's not that we'll calculate that for the benefit of getting money or something like that, no. But to put balance of our data with the scientist data, to put balance of our positions with the other positions, like the company's positions or the government's positions, no, to provide evidence of our contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptations. That is why it is important, because otherwise they will think that we are not exist. We have to talk in their language. Sometimes people don't understand us because we don't talk in their language. Same as we don't understand them because they don't talk in our language. So how we find this in common? So that's why I think it's important to show evidence of our contributions in this context.
So thank you. So we have another question here, which links to that, is what can we do as a community to promote and ensure that indigenous communities are included on climate science and policy? So not as a topic, but as actors and decision makers. So how do you make sure that the indigenous side is in there, as a decision maker and an actor? I mean, for example, is anyone working with Greta, or are there any young youth leaders working with Greta, for example, or is it all separate? How do you make sure that they're included as decision makers and as actors, not just as a side issue?
You ask who?
Well, whoever wants to answer.
Just a quick comment on this. Yeah. Actually, now we, together with many indigenous groups and in different part of the world, we are working on campaigning for nature and community-based solutions. Mm-hmm. Nature cannot just be themselves and become solutions, but they need initiative from communities, protection from communities, no, so they can become solutions. So community and nature and community-based solutions is our proposals for our campaign now for the UNFCCC and for any international agendas.
Fiona, did you want to add on that?
Yeah, I just want to say that a lot of climate activists, as I said, are just focused on climate, and they want to find only a solution to climate. And the problem is that climate is not, for a lot of people, is not really the biggest threat. It is a big threat, but the biggest threat has been the violation of the right and the human right for generations. It's not something new. climate is making everything worse, but they are facing so many human rights abuses. Mm-hmm. And I think that if the climate activists keep focusing on climate and not on the system that creates climate, but also create certain numbers of injustice, there won't be a lot of link. Because so if climate is the problem, every solution proposed to face climate change is good, which is not. The nature-based solutions, for example, who put a price on nature and on the land of indigenous people, are a threat for indigenous people. The compensation markets that solve part of, say, to mitigate climate change are a problem for indigenous people. Planting trees on their land, which are considered a nature-based solution, are a problem for indigenous people. So I think that the focus of climate movement should be climate as something completely separate, but always climate justice and social justice. Those things should be linked together. And we should be talking more about human rights also when we talk about climate. And I think until this human rights issue and social justice won't be completely inside the climate movement, this dialogue won't be really possible.
So practically, what would you say is the ask?
Well, I am not generalizing. Of course, I have deal with a lot of the people you are talking about, but I won't give numbers. But a lot of the people want states to commit to net zero, for example, mm-hmm. Which is something completely fake and dangerous. I think that they have to speak out, and they are doing it more and more. A lot of climate groups like Extinction Rebellion, they're all talking about decolonized conservation. They're all talking about fake solutions. So now this narrative is inside. But at the beginning, the climate movement was just asking decarbonize our economy, face climate change, which of course are big threats, but the climate change is a consequence of a system. And we can't just solve climate change if we don't change our way of life. And asking a very explicit criticism toward our capitalism and our growth economy paradigm was not in the discourse of climate activists at the beginning. Now they're changing, and I have to say that it's a good news.
So do you think that, for example, we need to have a young indigenous, poster child like Greta to work with Greta? I mean, the public needs simple things that they can understand. Or do we need to do, for example, some of the comments are saying we need to have an indigenous citizenship thing, which all school children can sign up on, where they learn the values of indigenous communities, where they learn, or they do, as Mina was saying, learn about each other on Zoom. I mean, so, practically speaking, what are we talking about here that's going to help move the thing forward?
I don't understand why it should be Greta or whoever. I mean, indigenous people have been fighting against climate change and their consequences for generations. And I think we should acknowledge that the climate movement is not a Western movement. I have been working with indigenous people and the organization I represent, so me, not so long, but my organization for 30 years. And indigenous people were talking about climate change along.
Yeah, but I'm saying, do you need like a young indigenous person to be a poster child, to be kind of an equivalent, or to work with Greta? I'm just trying to think of something that, because, saying we've done it for 30 years, I mean, if it's still not out there as visible, it's happening, you're saying, but what can be done to make things move forward? People are very excited about the idea of school, doing stuff across schools, or as Mina was saying, was bringing a young person. I mean, I'm just trying to think of a way from a campaign point of view that you can bring it forward, make it more visible.
Yeah, well, we have been trying to, for example, we organized a counter Congress against the Congress of Nature that has been done in Marseille, which was a big Congress. And we have been pushing for these issues. The problem is that the press is not covering the issue, and no one wants to cover the issue, because any criticism toward climate solutions, or any criticism toward conservation is considered a criticism against the environmental movement, which is not. And I think that if we depoliticize, it's easy to talk about indigenous knowledge. That sounds nice. But it's not the issue. The issue is the land. It's land. It's the right to the land. And I think that if we want to bring attention about this, we need to educate the people to understand that the solutions we are proposing against climate change are completely not going to work, because it makes us feeling well, but it's not something that's going to work. We don't need to I understand that people need simple messages, but things are also complex. And this is climate is not unrelated, it's not a thing separate from social justice. So I think we need to educate. Education is, of course, very important. But and how to do that? The press has a very important role. And this webinar might have, also important role. So I think that the work to do is not just linking indigenous communities with activists here, like in a webinar. Already just informing them of what is going on, it's already a big issue. I don't know if any of you have access, but I have been doing this work with a lot of climate movements a lot of times. We meet and we talk. And I think that this is part. Education is part, of course, of the real thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mina, what do you think needs to happen? Do you think we need a young indigenous poster child to work with Greta to do this balance, or to do more on education? Everyone seems very excited about this idea of their kids and doing something. What do you think needs to happen to bring the visibility and to move things forward from a campaign point of view?
I think everyone have their role, yeah, and I think we should grateful to have Greta to open I think like provide the framing of this, and provide the opportunities for the youth to be more to have more voice, and that's her role. But I believe we have our own role here, like what I already talk about. Indigenous youth in Indonesia have their own role with their homecoming movement, with the smartphone movement. I think everyone have their own, and we have to appreciate each role of us that trying to save the planet. And I think make more local initiative. I think it's much better, yeah, to talk about more local initiative and encourage more local initiative to start protecting planet. But I have to say I really agree with Fiore, because sometimes we are lost in all these discussions about climate change. People not seeing the real problem. We have governance situations that corrupt governance. We have the companies that encroaching our land and territories, and they're not stopping. Of course, they will use anything to protect their businesses, and it's happened everywhere. Even like someone talk about nature-based solutions here as the company's campaign. Yes, of course. That's why, I mean, we need to return to our basic problem. That is actually not really much new problem from before, and it's not settled yet. So we are moving from one problem, it's not finished yet, and then another problem. And I think we really need to go back and see where we are standing.
Go back to the basics.
Yeah, for me, the protection of our rights on our land and territories, that is the most important thing.
Excellent. And Gigi, are you there?
I am, yes.
Gigi, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, Samantha. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to let you know that we are 3 minutes over time.
Oh,
so
okay.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if everyone just had some, maybe last comments before we wrap up, but I'll let you take care of that. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Gigi, if you have any comment or last comment, I'd love to end on another poem, but if everyone wants to have a closing comment, maybe Gigi.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just want to echo what Fiore and Mina have been saying. Climate justice is a social issue. It is a cultural issue. It is what has been built upon already like problematic and like destructive histories and like foundings of all of it. It's all inherently negative and bad. And so like, how do you work from there? I don't think that, I think Greta is who she is because of the media. And I think that if the same, way of covering, what Indigenous people are doing was extended to them, I think that there would be a much like larger presence of, Indigenous people in the media. But it's not, because there is institutionalized systems that constantly work against us. That's how it's been built. That's how it is. How do we change that? Indigenous people are already working on that. They have been working on that. It's non-Indigenous people that have to support them, because systems of oppression work against us and they benefit others. So the ones that it benefits, it's their moral responsibility and it's their moral imperative to absolutely help them in any way that they can, or at least that is my opinion. And so, yeah, I don't think there needs to be a poster child that feels rather like tokenizing and also like not representative of an entire, Indigenous community of the world, let alone whatever community that this, poster child is from. So, yeah.
Okay, and Fiona, and then I'll let Mina have the last word. Did you want to say something quickly? I love this idea of climate justice. Did you have any final closing comment, Fiona, and then we'll leave with Mina?
No, just that I would completely agree with Gigi and Mina said, and I am very honored to be in this panel talking about these important issues. And again, I will repeat it because I think it's very important. Talking about climate and environment without including social justice is not possible. There won't be biodiversity and future for this world without human diversity, and I think it's important to remember that. Mina, anything? I love the idea of climate justice. Sorry, I'm new on this. For me, that's the first time I've heard it, but it seems to encapsulate both. What would you say, Mina, as your closing comment?
I think not really much, but again, land and our rights and to land and territories is really important, because that is the foundation of everything else, including our culture and everything.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you. I was hugely honored. I was called in at the last minute because the original presenter, poor thing, he had a sudden emergency, but it's been a huge privilege to hear all your wonderful comments. And please try and do something. I think kids all over the world would absolutely love to have an Indigenous exchange and to learn more about the values and what needs to be asked to get them mobilized as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And good luck with this really important work on climate justice and more. Thank you. Thank you. And also, Gigi, please share on social media your beautiful poems. We'd love to share them. They were absolutely inspiring. Thank you, everyone, and all your wonderful ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fiore, Gigi.
Thank you, Mina, Gigi, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.